It began as an ordinary afternoon, the kind that rarely leaves a trace in memory. A retiree running an errand. Grandchildren in the car, absorbed in the quiet familiarity of being with someone they trusted completely. Nothing about the moment suggested it would become permanent, or that it would divide life into a before and an after. What happened next unfolded quickly, but its impact would stretch far beyond those few seconds. An attempted carjacking ended in gunfire, and Leonard Price was shot. The crime itself was brief, but it left behind something far more enduring. Children who witnessed violence firsthand, a family forced into sudden grief, and a community left searching for meaning in something that made no sense. This story does not begin with the suspect, and it does not linger on the mechanics of the crime. It begins with the silence that followed, with the shock that settles in when a trusted adult doesn't stand back up, with the confusion children carry when the world proves, without warning, that it can be dangerous even in moments that feel safe. For investigators, this case would demand care beyond standard procedure. The most critical witnesses were not hardened adults or bystanders at a distance, but young children whose memories were still forming, whose understanding of safety was still fragile. Every question asked would carry weight. Every detail reconstructed would have emotional consequences. But this case is also about what refused to be lost. As news spread, the focus slowly shifted away from the violence itself and toward the man at its center. Leonard Price was not defined by the way his life ended. He was known for decades of mentorship, for his presence in church halls and community spaces, for the quiet consistency that made people feel seen and supported. In the days that followed, those stories surfaced again and again, as if the community itself was pushing back against the idea that a single act could erase a lifetime. What remains is a story about legacy, trauma, and remembrance. About how violence reaches further than its immediate victims, and how communities respond when innocence is shaken. And about a family, especially children, who must now carry memories they never should have had to form. This is not just a case file. It is an examination of what happens after the noise fades, when the focus shifts from what was taken to who was lost. Before his name appeared in a police report or a news headline, Leonard Price was known simply as Mr. Price. To his family, he was a steady presence. To his neighbors, a familiar face. To his church community, someone whose influence was felt more through consistency than volume. He was a retiree who had settled into a life defined by routine, service, and time spent with the people who mattered most to him. Leonard had reached a stage of life where urgency had softened into intention. His days were not rushed. They were structured around small responsibilities, regular church involvement, and, most importantly, his grandchildren. Time with them was not occasional or ceremonial. It was woven into everyday life. Errands became opportunities for conversation. Car rides became moments of quiet supervision and trust. He was the kind of grandfather whose presence made parents feel reassured, whose calm demeanor created a sense of safety without needing to be announced. In his church, Leonard was known as a mentor. Not formally titled, not positioned at the front of the room, but present in ways that lasted. He guided younger members through difficult periods, offered advice when asked, and listened more often than he spoke. Over decades, that consistency built something stronger than reputation. It built trust. People remembered him not for a single defining achievement, but for showing up, week after week, year after year. That steady life is important to understand, because it stands in direct contrast to the way his story would later be told. When violence enters a narrative, it has a way of flattening everything that came before it. A person becomes a victim. A life becomes a single moment. But Leonard Price was not shaped by chaos. He was shaped by routine, by responsibility, and by care for others. At Beyond the Evidence, this channel exists to slow those moments down, to look past the headline and ask who a person was before their life intersected with crime. If you value stories that center humanity over spectacle, this is a good time to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications. Every case here is approached with care, context, and respect for the people at its center. Understanding Leonard's background is not about sentimentality. It is about accuracy. It explains why his loss reverberated the way it did, and why the trauma that followed extended far beyond the immediate family. When someone whose role is to provide stability is suddenly taken, the absence is not abstract. It is felt in daily routines, in expectations that no longer hold, and in the quiet spaces where that person used to be. Leonard Price lived a life that was largely unnoticed by the broader world, and that was by design. He did not seek attention. He sought usefulness. And it was that quiet, dependable presence that made what came next so devastating, not just because of how he died, but because of who he was before it happened. Within Leonard Price's family, his role was not defined by authority, but by reliability. He was the person others counted on to be consistent, calm, and present. That kind of role is often invisible until it's gone, but while he was alive, it shaped the emotional rhythm of the household. His presence offered reassurance, not through grand gestures, but through repetition and trust. As a grandfather, Leonard represented safety in its most uncomplicated form. Time spent with him followed predictable patterns, shared errands, familiar routes, quiet conversations, and moments of supervision that didn't feel restrictive. For his grandchildren, being with him meant being protected. It meant nothing unexpected was supposed to happen. That assumption, built slowly over time, formed the foundation of how they understood the world around them. Within the broader family, Leonard was also a stabilizing force during moments of stress or uncertainty. He was someone people turned to for perspective, especially when emotions ran high. He didn't escalate tension or dominate conversations. Instead, he listened, offered measured advice, and reminded others to slow down. That emotional steadiness helped regulate the family as a whole, creating an environment where problems felt manageable rather than overwhelming. Leonard's relationship with his wife was similarly rooted in partnership and longevity. Their life together had moved beyond early milestones into something quieter and more interdependent. Responsibilities were shared. Decisions were familiar. There was an unspoken understanding built over years, one that didn't require constant affirmation. When he left the house that day, there was no sense of disruption, no lingering concern. It was an ordinary departure, supported by years of routine. These dynamics matter because they explain the depth of the rupture that followed. The loss of Leonard was not just the loss of a person, but the removal of an emotional anchor. For the adults in the family, it meant losing a source of calm and guidance. For the children, it meant the sudden collapse of a basic assumption, that adults who protect you are supposed to be invulnerable. After the shooting, family members would struggle to reconcile their memories of Leonard as steady and reassuring with the reality of what the children had witnessed. The contrast was stark. The same person who embodied safety had become associated with fear and confusion through no fault of his own. That dissonance would shape how the family processed grief, especially as they tried to support children who no longer felt secure in the ways they once did. Leonard's role in the family was never about control or visibility. It was about presence. And when that presence was abruptly removed, the absence was not abstract. It was felt in routines that no longer made sense, in questions that didn't have comforting answers, and in the emotional labor required to help children navigate something they were never meant to see. This family was built on stability, and stability, once broken, is difficult to restore. Understanding these relationships is essential to understanding why the events that followed would leave such lasting emotional consequences, not just because of what happened, but because of who it happened to. The day Leonard Price was shot did not begin with tension or apprehension. There were no arguments, no sense of urgency, no indication that anything was out of place. It was structured like countless days before it, familiar plans, a known route, grandchildren in the car, and a destination that required no second thought. In every visible way, it was routine. That ordinariness is a critical part of this story. There were no early warning signs Leonard could have recognized, no suspicious interactions leading up to the moment. He was not engaged in risky behavior or an unusual situation. The attempted carjacking occurred without build-up, interrupting a scene that had all the markers of safety and normalcy. Violence did not escalate, it arrived. For the children in the vehicle, nothing about the day suggested danger. They were passengers in a trusted space, guided by someone whose role had always been to protect and supervise. The absence of warning is what made the moment so disorienting. There was no time to process what was happening or why. 1 second followed another, and the context they relied on to understand the world no longer applied. From an investigative standpoint, the lack of early indicators complicated the narrative. This was not a case where choices could be retraced or decisions questioned in hindsight. The randomness of the encounter meant there were no clear preventative measures to examine, no sequence of missteps that led to the crime. The incident existed as an intrusion, not a consequence. Leonard's behavior in those moments, as later reconstructed, aligned with the way he lived his life, calm, measured, and unassuming. There was no indication that he anticipated what was about to happen. That detail matters because it reinforces the central truth of the case. This was not a story of escalation, but of interruption. A life moving steadily forward was abruptly forced off its path. For the family, especially the children, the absence of warning would later become one of the most difficult aspects to reconcile. Trauma often searches for cause and effect, for something that could have been done differently. In this case, there was nothing to identify. No earlier moment to point to and say, that's when it started. The violence stood alone, unannounced and unexplained. This lack of context would shape every conversation that followed. It influenced how detectives approached the family, how caregivers spoke to the children, and how the community tried to make sense of the loss. When a crime emerges from an ordinary moment, it challenges the belief that danger can be predicted or avoided. What began as a simple day became the dividing line between expectation and reality. And in the seconds that followed, the story moved from routine into something irreversible, setting the stage for the event that would define everything that came next. What happened next unfolded in a matter of seconds, but those seconds would stretch far beyond their brief duration. An attempted carjacking interrupted the stillness of the day, turning an ordinary moment into one defined by fear and confusion. Gunfire followed, and Leonard Price was shot. The violence itself was sudden and contained, but its impact expanded outward immediately. This is where many true crime stories linger, dissecting movements and mechanics. This case does not require that. The significance of what occurred lies not in how the crime was carried out, but in who was present to witness it. Leonard's grandchildren were in the car, close enough to see that something was terribly wrong, close enough to sense that the adult they trusted was no longer able to protect them in the way he always had. For children, understanding danger relies heavily on cues from adults. In that moment, those cues disappeared. There was no explanation that made sense, no framework to process why a stranger's actions had shattered the safety they assumed was guaranteed. The crime was not just an act of violence, it was a sudden collapse of certainty. Leonard's response in those moments, as later understood, reflected the same steadiness that defined his life. There was no chaos attached to him, no indication of panic. That contrast, between his calm presence and the abrupt violence, made the moment even more jarring for those who witnessed it. The person who symbolized protection was rendered vulnerable without warning. The escalation was immediate and final. There was no prolonged confrontation, no drawn-out sequence that might allow the mind to adjust. One moment followed another with devastating speed. For the children, memory would later isolate fragments rather than a continuous narrative. Sensations, confusion, and the unmistakable understanding that something irreversible had occurred. Importantly, this section of the story does not belong to the person who attempted the carjacking. Their actions are relevant only insofar as they altered lives. Centering the act itself risks overshadowing the real consequence, the emotional imprint left on young witnesses and the loss of a man whose presence anchored an entire family. In the aftermath of those seconds, silence took on a different weight. The world did not immediately register what had happened, but for the family inside that vehicle, nothing would ever feel routine again. The crime marked the end of one version of life, and the beginning of another, defined by absence, questions, and trauma. These seconds did not echo because of their violence alone. They echoed because they introduced children to a reality they were never meant to encounter, and because they ended a life that had been built on care rather than conflict. What followed would not be measured in minutes or hours, but in years of emotional reckoning. In the hours following the shooting, the focus shifted from the moment itself to the people left behind. For Leonard Price's family, time moved unevenly. Practical decisions had to be made in the middle of shock, while emotional processing lagged far behind. The children were removed from the scene and placed into the care of adults who now had to explain something that defied explanation. News of Leonard's death spread quickly through the community, but it did not travel as a headline alone. It moved through phone calls, church conversations, and quiet exchanges between people who had known him for years. What emerged almost immediately was a collective insistence on remembering him as more than a victim. The violence was acknowledged, but it did not dominate the narrative for long. At his church, members gathered not only to grieve, but to share stories. People spoke about Leonard's decades of mentorship, about the way he offered guidance without judgment and support without expectation. These memories formed a counterweight to the brutality of the crime. In retelling who Leonard was, the community reclaimed him from the circumstances of his death. For Leonard's widow, the outpouring of support was both a comfort and a reminder of the scale of the loss. Meals were delivered. Offers of help came steadily. Yet every gesture underscored the reality that the person who once shared daily life with her was gone. Community support softened the isolation of grief, but it could not remove it. The children remained at the center of concern. Adults around them moved carefully, aware that exposure to violence at such a young age carries lasting consequences. Conversations were measured. Routines were adjusted. The priority became stability, reintroducing predictability where it had been abruptly taken away. The community's response reflected a shared understanding that healing would take time, especially for those who had witnessed the event. Public reaction remained subdued, shaped largely by the way Leonard was remembered rather than the details of the crime. There was no rush to sensationalize, no attempt to turn tragedy into spectacle. Instead, attention lingered on the loss of a man who had quietly invested in others for decades. That collective restraint helped set the tone for everything that followed. In the immediate aftermath, grief did not isolate the family, it surrounded them. The response was not loud or performative, but steady, mirroring the way Leonard himself had lived. Through shared memory and presence, the community asserted that while violence had taken a life, it would not define it. From the outset, investigators understood that this case required a different kind of approach. The most important witnesses were children, and the information they carried was inseparable from trauma. Standard procedures gave way to caution, patience, and restraint. The goal was not speed, but accuracy, gathered in a way that would not deepen existing wounds. Detectives worked closely with the family, coordinating with specialists trained to speak with children who had experienced violence. Questions were paced carefully, phrased in ways that avoided suggestion or pressure. Sessions were limited in length, allowing space for rest and emotional regulation. Every detail mattered, but not at the expense of the children's well-being. Reconstructing Leonard Price's final moments became an exercise in balance. Investigators needed clarity, yet they remained aware that each recollection carried emotional weight. Memories surfaced unevenly, often fragmented, shaped by fear and confusion rather than sequence. Rather than forcing a linear narrative, detectives allowed the picture to form gradually, accepting gaps where certainty could not be responsibly claimed. What emerged was not a story filled with dramatic revelations or unexpected twists. Instead, it confirmed what the family already knew. The encounter was sudden, unprovoked, and brief. There was no hidden dispute, no underlying conflict waiting to be uncovered. The crime did not grow from a longer chain of events. It stood alone, stark and senseless. For investigators, that realization carried its own weight. Cases often seek motive as a way to impose logic on tragedy. Here, motive offered little comfort. The absence of complexity did not lessen the harm, it emphasized the vulnerability of ordinary moments. Leonard had not placed himself in danger through choice or circumstance. He had been interrupted by violence that required no reason beyond opportunity. Throughout the investigation, detectives remained conscious of the family's emotional state. Updates were delivered with care. Language was chosen deliberately, avoiding unnecessary detail. The process became less about pursuing dramatic closure and more about establishing truth with integrity. Even as leads were followed and evidence reviewed, the human cost remained central. The major revelation of this investigation was not about who Leonard Price was in his final moments, but about what the case represented. It revealed how quickly violence can enter ordinary life, and how deeply it can affect those least equipped to understand it. The investigation did its job in answering questions, but it could not resolve the larger ones: how to restore safety, how to protect innocence once it has been fractured. In the end, The truth uncovered was heavy not because it was complicated, but because it was simple. A life devoted to steadiness was ended without warning, and children were left carrying memories they did not choose. The investigation could document what happened, but it could not undo what had already changed. The conclusion of the investigation did not mark an ending for Leonard Price's family. In many ways, it marked the beginning of a longer, quieter struggle. While legal processes have clear timelines, trauma does not. The consequences of what the children witnessed followed them into spaces where the case itself no longer reached, into routines, relationships, and moments that once felt safe. For children, witnessing violence reshapes how the world is understood. Safety becomes conditional rather than assumed. Ordinary situations can carry unexpected tension. For Leonard's grandchildren, the memory of that day did not exist as a single event, but as a series of emotional responses that surfaced unpredictably: fear during car rides, heightened alertness in public places, questions that returned without warning. The adults around them were forced into new roles. Caregivers became translators of reality, tasked with explaining loss while preserving a sense of security. Grief had to be managed alongside reassurance. The challenge was not only to mourn Leonard, but to do so in a way that did not overwhelm the children's developing sense of stability. Every decision, from daily routines to emotional conversations, carried added weight. Leonard's widow faced her own version of this long shadow. Her grief unfolded privately, shaped by years of shared life and the sudden absence of a partner who had anchored her daily existence. Support from the community remained present, but the quiet moments were unavoidable. The future she had imagined now required redefinition, one day at a time. The family's dynamics shifted in subtle but lasting ways. Leonard had been a calming influence, someone who absorbed tension and offered perspective. Without that presence, others had to step forward, often while carrying their own grief. Stability became something that required conscious effort rather than something that naturally existed. Beyond the family, the case prompted broader reflection within the community. Conversations emerged about safety, about the unseen consequences of violent crime, and about how children process experiences they cannot fully articulate. Leonard's death became a point of reference, not as a warning story, but as a reminder of vulnerability and responsibility. These consequences did not resolve neatly. There was no single moment of closure, no clear line separating grief from healing. Instead, the impact settled into everyday life, shaping how trust was rebuilt and how memories were carried forward. Leonard's life continued to influence those around him, even in absence, through the values he had modeled and the care he had given. The long shadow of witness violence is not defined solely by fear. It is also defined by resilience, by the slow work of adaptation, and by the effort to honor what was lost without being consumed by how it was lost. That balance would define the family's path forward, even as the story moved toward its final reflection.